We have Jane Curtis with us this morning talking about blood transfusions through history, and I'm just going to turn it over to her and find out what we can find out.
All right. I wanted to announce first that this is an anniversary. This is the 7th anniversary, 7 years of our program.
That's right.
History.
If you want to give blood, we have it right here. You don't have to go anywhere.
Exactly. Good thing. No, we are going to talk about it today in the hope that people will find it interesting, perhaps consider donating some blood.
Okay.
But it is a fascinating subject in itself. It's a little difficult to get just a one step after the other presentation of it because there's so many interesting sidelights to it. But I think perhaps we might start out by saying when you go in to give blood, what happens? They prick your finger. And of course you have filled out forms and your doctor has approved that it's okay. And pricking your finger is for a very important purpose and for a very, very smart machine. And 3 things, they do it for 3 reasons. The first thing they want to get out of it is your iron content in your blood. And if it's too low, they will say, sorry, but please, go away and build up your iron content and come back later. Otherwise, they go right on ahead and they check for your blood count and for your rhesus factor, your RH factor. And we may talk about those things. I suppose we could talk about them right now. You see the difficulty in doing this?
Right.
Or shall we say a little more? The general history of it, earliest date I can mention is 1492.
Oh.
When not only did Columbus sail the ocean blue, but allegedly Pope Innocent VIII was treated for something with a blood transfusion. Now, they always put this under transfusion, but it was not apparently that. Pope Innocent, who wasn't so innocent, he had a couple of children, in fact, but he had a physician, renowned physician of the day, Italian, and this physician had said, the Pope had developed a fever, a serious fever. He said, you've got to have the blood of 3 10-year-old boys.
Oh, my goodness.
And all the sources...
Sounds almost like witchcraft.
Well, it sort of does. But I have a feeling that he was to drink the blood, not have it transfused into his bloodstream.
Okay.
Because at that time they weren't really into that. But of course he died, of course, as did the 3 little boys. Mm-hmm. But the next time it comes up on the screen for us is a couple of centuries later, in the 1600s, and all kinds of things burgeoned in that century scientifically. Galileo, he was born in the middle of the 1500s, so he was just hitting his prime then with all of his investigations, and of course he was into lenses and things at that time. And in England, Harvey, the one who made the famous discoveries about blood circulation, key point. And they began to figure out that anything that you put into that bloodstream was going to go through the whole system. That dawned on them later. Okay. Reports differ on whether he actually tried to do any transfusing or not. But he, at any rate, was in the field. And in the middle of that century, you had other people in England cropping up, people in France. And as it turns out later, there were some people in Germany playing around with it. So it might have been pretty well universal in Europe. And also when you think back at some of the natives in places like Borneo and so on, the headhunter type people, and the people who considered that if you had your enemy's blood, if you could get some of your enemies, you kill the enemy, and then you would take some of their blood. And there's a suggestion that perhaps in those days they knew how to do that, slit a wrist or whatever, or just drink it or whatever. So the thinking about blood anyway goes back about that far, about back to the 15th century. When they first got the idea of transfusing it, it was animal to animal. And this, I want to just read you, this is the only thing I'm going to read you. But Samuel Peeps, the famous diarist
Yes.
of that century, kind of boring, but interesting references. The person who lived at the time, contemporary references. Samuel Peeps, let's see. He attended an evening at Gresham College, one of the universities there, where he saw a dog-to-dog experiment. And this is a quote: "At the meeting of Gresham College tonight, there was a pretty experiment of the blood of one dog let out, till he died, into the body of another on one side," this is on one side of the donor, "while all his own ran out the other side." So they had this poor dog there with a penetration in each side there, and one just dying, and the other one, the blood going into another dog. The first died upon the place, and the other turned out very well and likely to do well. This did give occasion to many, many pretty wishes, many nice wishes, as, for example, the blood of a Quaker to be let into an archbishop. A little bit bizarre, and such like. But then they suggest here that it might be of use to human health for the mending of bad blood by borrowing from a better body. And in a way, that's what we do.
We do, but they were thinking of the personality, probably.
Well, they were
and
thinking.
the beliefs.
And at the beginning, you know, the transfusion, when they started getting into it to people, was not for wounds and operations and so on. It was for mental things. If anybody was a little bit off, they thought their humors were out of balance. You know, they had humors and all this mumbo jumbo.
Right.
So the only way to do that was to diddle with the blood, and this was the background of it for quite some time. There were these other experiments occurred. Could we see picture number 1, where they started using animals on people? And again, it was for the purpose if they were a little bit odd. Cracked was the term
Cracked.
Peeps used. But in this picture, number 1, we can see this tiny lamb. They used little lambs and calves, in other words, young animals. And here he sits, this fellow, and he allegedly a little bit out of it, and the long-bearded scientist next to him. And of course, they all had to be direct in those days because blood would coagulate instantly.
Right.
If they let it out. But up at the top corner there, you see an interesting thing. You see a bunch of instruments. They look kind of like double-headed syringes. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of what they were. At that time, instruments were devised by one of the English people who was into this game. And I don't think they probably called it a syringe at that time, but that's what it was. And what led him to develop it mainly was the fact that they couldn't regulate how much they put in. The other person or the other creature. So this was the earliest picture that I found for this. This was in the mid-1600s, 1667 or 8. But eventually, it was done fairly often and usually not successfully.
Right.
Usually everybody would die. And finally it was forbidden. It was forbidden in England and France by law, and the Pope over in Italy chimed in. So it became really off the screen. But as the 1700s came up, of course, science didn't die out at that point. People were still fooling around with it. But when 1800 came along, even that century, the 19th century, a lot of developments occurred at that point. Picture number 2 is just, of course, a drawing, or a picture painting, but this shows you that blood still had to be direct from person to person and covered and not hit the light of day because they couldn't do anything about the coagulating of the blood. But people stood around, and there was Probably it was not the most sanitary thing in the world.
You certainly wouldn't see that today.
You certainly wouldn't see that today. There's some other paintings I found too that show, one of them shows a lady kind of spread-eagled on a couch wearing a filmy gown, you know, and people clustering around. So, but it did not, it hadn't died out completely, the idea had not. But early then in the century, they started making progress. And they discovered, first of all, that you had to be clean about it. And they began to realize, and by the middle of the century, in fact, I think 1842, they discovered that there were different types. One transfusion might succeed, and another one, the person become horribly sick with jaundice or die or whatever, and they hadn't figured it out. Well, they did figure it out, that there were these different types of blood. And the next picture, please. There are different components to our blood. And when they prick your finger and they take that sample, it goes into a machine, and I think it's a centrifuge. I think the main method is to whirl it around and cause the different elements, the lighter and the heavier, to part. You know, like cream will come off milk, that sort of thing. So you had the blood cells, the red ones and the white ones, and then you had a little band there of platelets, and you had no, that's right. And the top one, at the top, you have the plasma of the liquid part of the blood, because the blood is all of this solid matter floating around in a liquid solution. And they discovered that this was indeed the case, and they were able to begin to differentiate. If you didn't want the whole thing, supposing you just wanted some platelets, well, they understand were used mainly for injuries and wounds, burns and things, because they would be drawn to it. They would gather there and cause the blood to coagulate more, and they refined it then to which part of the blood was most useful for which problems. They also, when you took the blood out of veins or even arteries, if you took it all out, they would collapse.
Right.
And something had to be done about that. Here's another picture you can see now where the plasma at the top, which is it's a little over half of the volume of any given sample of blood. And the leukocyte, where it says leukocytes and thrombosis, that's your white blood cells. And at the bottom you have your, and the platelets. And at the bottom you have your colored. And I understand that it only becomes red after it leaves the heart and goes through the lungs. That's an interesting thing. I didn't pursue that. But they discovered these things then. This picture will come a little later, and they started having at it. But they were not having universal success, and the next step in realizing it was that all blood is not the same, and all blood is not compatible with all blood. And this was very important and discovered in, I believe, again, toward the mid-1800s. But it was divided into three categories, and these were these three that we saw here. The red blood cells and the white blood cells and the platelets, thank you, make up the solid part of any sample of blood. Now it turns out that if you combine the wrong types of blood, you either get a serious reaction or some kind of illness, or the person may even die, depending on it. But what it does, apparently, it causes clumping because the red cells or the cells to clump together, and that means that they get too big to fit through the veins.
Sure.
And again, this is really a technical subject, and I can't talk about details beyond that, but I think that's important to understanding what happens, and what happens if you get the wrong kind. Now, this was refined again over the years, after they discovered that all blood can't be used for all people, and that the early ones apparently were just lucky.
Yeah.
But they discovered the 3 blood types, and this is determined again by that little sample from your pinprick, which type you are. Okay. But they were also not necessarily having 100% success observing the rules they learned from that. They had considered, for example, that type O, you have A and B and O, that O was just universal across the board. But one man, I believe this was another obstetrician, discovered that a woman and her husband both had type O blood, and they had a little history of miscarriages or of dead births, which was even worse, stillbirths. And they determined from this, they did some more research, that there is a difference, and this is where your plus factor and your minus factor enter the picture. So again, it keeps being narrowed down and down. It's a lot like how they figured out some things in languages. There'd be exceptions to the rules, and then those exceptions would not prove to be steady. The exceptions would have exceptions. Right. Well, this is what was happening there. But they pursued it, and they figured out, again, how to get around that. Now, that little chart that you had up a moment ago, which I think is all right. I think you can see that reasonably well. You see at the very top on the left, in the vertical column, you have type O positive, and then you have type O negative, and I guess you have the negative first and then positive. And you have it for the A's and the B's as well. And there is some interesting phenomenon where there's an A and a B together. But now these others, as you look across, the only thing that a type O negative can receive is a type O negative. And anybody can receive the type O negative. But positive, which means that it reacts badly with your red blood cells and causes these bad things. You can see then it's a alternating pattern there. So you have that for each one of the things. Now, mine happens to be B+, for example. So I would know, or they would know when they test it, that all I can have is B, some kind of B or some kind of A and B together. I can't have any of the others. Why they don't have the general, the O, type O on this chart, because it is a universal type in various circumstances, which I don't know. And there's a great deal of material on this when I went online to look for it. So I think we could answer that question. But in the meantime, we could safely leave it to our medical people to take care of that. They discourage the use of type O blood because if an emergency comes up and it's the only type. See, if you don't have time to test the person or the machine, they will use it for that. Whereas if they're just using it when they can test it, when they know, they're wasting it, so to speak, if the other type is available. So these things are. We might as well go on while we're looking. We have a couple more things here in the picture line. We have number 6, which is one of the only really cartoon I can find. They making a joke about it, and what those two people say. One is was a scientist, the technician. The other one is getting the blood, and something's starting to happen. They're saying, "What's your zodiac sign?" And he says, "Oh, I'm a, whatever it is, a Capricorn." "Oh, no wonder we're having all this trouble. This blood comes from a Taurus." So there occasionally, I suppose that's from some medical journal. It didn't say when I found it, but there's a light side. Now, this is very important for people who can't tolerate it, or people who are religious and who don't want it. Right. And this will be a little, you can see it's got a little thing on here, a little ribbon or something, to put onto the person and indicate that they are not to be given what they say they shouldn't have, what they shouldn't have. They also have little bracelets, little red bracelets that they can put on if you're not to have it. So if you don't want it, or if for any reason you're not supposed to have it, they have volume expanders, what's called volume expanders, because if they take your blood, now what they do in this remarkable thing at the beginning, if they're only taking platelets from you, they will put the others back. They will give it back to you. And this means that somewhere in the process, you will need to have some kind of expander, possibly, and I guess not always unless it's a lot. But when you get into it, you realize the different things that they've had to study and worry about to get into being able to do this. The use of whole blood or of any one of these parts of it is still the only thing that works. Artificial blood still does not exist. They have tried and tried, and apparently there's some product in South Africa that they claim will work. And also there's a salt saline solution that they say if the blood loss is not too great, they can use that and fill in, and then your red blood will fill it in. Mm-hmm. But that's a difficult one to guess about too. And you know, your total blood, the average, they say, is 5 liters, which is, say, approximately 6 quarts, gallon and a half. But depending on your size, you know, some huge person is going to have a lot more, and somebody my size is going to have a lot less. Mm-hmm. So I've never been able to give blood because they won't take it. Mm-hmm. If you're below the 1 pint. Oh. And I wondered about that at first, but they said no, it's the equipment. The equipment is geared. These centrifuge little machines, whatever it is they use, are geared to a larger sample, and it won't work if you do a smaller sample. So
you can't give.
Well, no. If I even tried one time, you know, somebody. I was working in a place where one of the people had a child that one of the dreadful diseases that they didn't know what to do about it, but continuing blood transfusions were keeping the child alive. And it had to be B-, and mine was B+. But they said they wouldn't take mine anyway, because if they had two people, 2 smaller people, and they took 2, they could get a pint. But they said, no, and then we start mixing, because even if your blood is a certain type, your blood is your blood. You know, it's very distinctive to you. And a smaller sample, a hodgepodge, is probably not going to do anybody any good. No, wait, did I have? Yes, I had 2 more. Let's look at the next picture. This reminds us of the war years. Now, World War I was when they first started to give blood transfusions. And I don't think they had perfected the drying out of the plasma. But they had some means of doing it in World War I. But in World War II, meanwhile, in the 30s, they had perfected drying it out to a powder, and they had what they called the package. I guess it's the plasma package. And what they had 2 little cans, and one of them had the dried powder version. The other one had, I guess it was usually distilled water, but had the liquid anyway. And they could be combined, and they would be good for a couple of days, at least. And of course, you could take that out. They mentioned using it in North Africa and in Europe, and use it as needed. And you picture these scenarios like MASH, you know, where you have these field conditions, and where they could actually do something like that. And of course, refrigeration came along. Anticoagulants were another thing that they needed to develop so that the blood wouldn't coagulate when you didn't want it to. The ins and outs of anticoagulating are pretty technical. I'm not going to touch that. Yeah. But the point is that they can and do it. And anticoagulating and refrigerating were early on, at least early in the 1900s, if not maybe a little bit before, when they were developing refrigeration. So, yeah, it was widely used in the war. When the war began, England, of course, and the Blitz was on, they began to have a big need for blood. And in this country, some scientists were working on it. There was an Austrian scientist who had eventually immigrated to this country, and he was a prime mover in getting these packages because they were easy to ship and so on. Another important milestone was putting the blood in a bag. And apparently it is much safer. It's not breakable because it's a good sturdy, I guess, PVC type bag that they could put it in and manipulate it and deal with it very, very easily. I guess they don't use whole blood too much anymore, but they said that in something I read, they used the platelets, for example, for burns and wounds and things like that, and the red blood cells, loss of blood, when you wanted the whole blood in there, if it was possible to do it. The whole matter of doing it depends so much on these wonderful machines. Now, this, of course, this picture, to get back to this for a minute, the picture of Winston Churchill here, Bristol's blood transfusion campaign. You see the British, of course, had very powerful campaigns all over during the war. And then the final picture, the text on here is in Latin, and I can't figure out what the story of that was. But I think this is a very striking invitation. It underlines the importance of it, and it underlines the ease of doing it, that you really just have a little gizmo. And it takes over an hour. It takes about 70 minutes, they said, to do it, usually, on the average. But then you have your container here with the substance that's coming into you. And so now, from the early days when they were doing the covered translation and the animal translations, they of course weren't testing for type, and what they had was the donor had to be right there.
Right.
And if the donor, supposing this little lamb, you don't know what kind of blood it had, but you don't know what it might have been carrying in that blood. Because if you put certain insects, if it were insects and not animals, look what you might be getting. This whole Zika thing is, that's hit the fan now. So now there was one other particular.
Okay, we still have a couple of minutes.
All right, because there's. Oh yes, I know. I wanted to explain about the RH factor and how they used animals in that. Now the RH, capital R, small h, comes from the word rhesus, and the rhesus was a monkey. Mm-hmm. And monkeys apparently are fairly close to the human side. I guess we eventually came from the same thing. But they used these monkeys to figure out how you would get around that plus and minus factor. And I can dimly remember seeing something or other about RH factors, some big ad about a thing not too long ago, in fact, as though maybe they're paying more attention to it, because I guess most people don't know, wouldn't know what to do about it, and indeed they don't have to know what to do about it. But it's rather comforting to know, and it's fascinating how they got into all this. But when you think of the changing from the animal to the person, the first ones to use it, people to people, were really, really very brave to do it.
Yes, they would be.
And it was forbidden in many places. But do you know what your blood type is, for example?
I have no idea.
It's interesting
I think I
to
have
know.
it written down somewhere, but I don't know what it is.
Well, it's interesting to know, I suppose in case of emergency, but...
I may go down to the blood transfusion just to find out. I've always been refused because my pulse rate would go up too high.
Oh, so they're all also monitoring pulse. See, a couple of sources that I talked to didn't happen to mention that.
Right.
But that's an important thing, too, that they have figured out. But the actual blood and the transfusing of blood, blood was not used as such an important thing, was not considered such an important thing in the old days. And some of these many names and people that I've passed over in between here were people who made these small discoveries, but very important ones, telling people about, now, the blood, of course, for instance, in the racial situations, mixing blood, even if it was, just slashing this and things. Like now we're related. I'm you,
right.
yeah, doing this. That I think was illegal. Many things, but there was some. What it was, a showboat musical play.
Right.
There, they do that.
Okay, we're
and it's
down to
not,
the last few seconds here, but if somebody wanted to do more research on this, where would they go?
Well, they could start online.
Going into what site?
Well, I would just search. What I did was search. I think I phrased it diffusing blood or the diffusion of blood or something, to indicate it. I happen to have some other material on hand and some material, about other things about blood. But then when I went online, of course, it expanded it a great deal. But you find nice diagrams and pictures like these here, and you can answer questions often. There was one site that had a bunch of questions. Why should I do this? Why is it important? And all that.
Okay.
So.
Well, I think that sets us up for our blood drive here at Green Spring, and we have a date on that, I believe. I'm not sure.
27th.
27th of
Thursday, the 27th of October.
Of October, so it's coming up. And you need to make a reservation because it does take a while, and they can only take so many. So make your reservation to plan on going down there, and you'll notice it'll save 3 lives if you give blood. They divide it that way, and you never know. It might be your own.